Well, welcome to the 700 Club, an evil empire. That's what Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union all the way back in 1983. Evangelical Christians then cheered the speech, and it set the tone for an aggressive foreign policy that eventually led to the fall of the Soviet Union.
Well, 40 years later, that tone is shifting in the Republican Party. America's support for the war in Ukraine has become a major dividing point and a possible litmus test for GOP presidential candidates. David Brody explains.
Typically, Republican presidential candidates court evangelicals by talking about their faith or socially conservative issues like abortion and others. And while that still is happening today, the war in Ukraine has sort of flipped the GOP script. It has now become a litmus test. Candidates who take a more hawkish viewpoint have become the minority this time around. Just ask former VP Mike Pence, who faced tough questions from Tucker Carlson at a recent evangelical forum in Iowa.
I'm sorry, Mr. Vice President, have you, I know you're running for president. You are distressed that the Ukrainians don't have enough American tanks. Every city in the United States has become much worse over the past 3 years. Yeah. Drive around. There's not one city that's gotten better in the United States. Right. And it's visible. Our economy has degraded. The suicide rate has jumped. Public filth and disorder and crime have exponentially increased. And yet, your concern is that the Ukrainians, a country most people can't find on a map, who've received tens of billions of U.S. tax dollars, don't have enough tanks. I think it's a fair question to ask, like, where's the concern for the United States in that?
Well, it's not my concern. Tucker, I've heard that routine from you before, but that's not my concern. Anybody that says that we can't be the leader of the free world and solve our problems at home has a pretty small view of the greatest nation on earth. We can do both.
It's a subject that's clearly not going away and will force some soul-searching among certain candidates. Not only did Carlson reflect the changing Republican base, Pence, once an evangelical hero, heard boos and received no applause. He, along with GOP presidential contenders Tim Scott and Nikki Haley, represent a more traditional neoconservative approach, something Haley addressed in an interview with CBN News.
Russia's not going to stop at Ukraine. They're going to go into Poland and the Baltics, and we've got a world war on our hands. We have to make sure we send a message to every enemy that if you mess with our friends, you're messing with us, and you don't want to do that.
Those views follow the Ronald Reagan model in terms of embracing a robust overseas strategy in order to protect America.
We in America have learned bitter lessons from 2 world wars. It is better to be here ready to protect the peace than to take blind shelter across the sea, rushing to respond only after freedom is lost. We've learned that isolationism never was and never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical governments with an expansionist intent.
That interventionist mindset continued through 9/11 with tough talk by George W. Bush against countries like Iraq, Iran, and North Korea.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. Back
then, Americans saw the invasion of Iraq and the start of the war on terrorism in Afghanistan. In 2001, 96% of Republicans supported that war in Afghanistan. Oh, how times have changed. 20 years later, just 43% of Republicans saw that as a war worth fighting, signaling a growing move toward isolationism. After 9/11, 23% of Americans wanted less foreign involvement. Today, that number is at 30%. And within the GOP, a whopping 71% want the U.S. to focus on problems at home rather than overseas. When Donald Trump entered the picture with his America First agenda in 2015, the GOP base joined the move against foreign intervention. That's resulted in a new guard of presidential candidates joining Trump, including Ron DeSantis and political newcomer Vivek Ramaswamy.
I don't believe in beating around the bush on this. I don't think we should be spending more money in Ukraine. The top job of the U.S. military, who would have ever thought, is to protect U.S. soil.
This weekend, former President Trump linked aid to Ukraine to the congressional investigation into the Biden family's business dealings. He said Congress shouldn't authorize any more weapon shipments to Ukraine until the Department of Justice and the IRS turn over evidence of what he calls corrupt family business dealings. Gordon?
Well, David, there seems to be a big divide between GOP leadership and the base of the party. So how do you see this ultimately playing out?
Well, I think right now, Gordon, GOP leadership is in control. I mean, they control what's brought to the House and Senate floor, or I should say the House floor, actually. And the truth of the matter is that they have the votes to do what they need to do. Now, there is a small contingent of that House Freedom Caucus we hear quite a bit about that's trying to derail some funding to Ukraine. For example, this defense authorization bill that is up for deliberation in the House and Senate this week, starting Thursday in the House. The House Freedom Caucus is trying to, in essence, strip some of that funding out. For example, $300 million to train and equip the Ukrainian military. They've been doing that for a decade or so. I'm talking about that program has been in place for about a decade or so. They want that $300 million stripped out, but that's not going anywhere. So ultimately, the GOP leadership has control of this narrative.
Well, let's talk just in terms of foreign policy. If the U.S. pulls back support for Ukraine and Russia is then able to conquer the country, I don't know if they will actually be able to do that. But if we pull back, does that send a signal across the world and specifically to China that it's going to be okay to invade Taiwan? I look at the current war and go, well, there was a complete failure to even object to the annexation of Crimea back in 2014. Different administration, but consistent foreign policy. We gave them a pass, and so they said, okay, they're going to give us another pass when we invade this time. Are we sending the wrong message to the world?
Well, I think that's what you're going to hear Mike Pence and Nikki Haley and so many of these others in GOP leadership say exactly that. And that has been the playbook by the Republican Party for very long. The problem is that when Donald Trump entered the scene, as we talked about in that piece, everything changed and it became Make America Great Again. Well, what did that mean exactly? Well, what it means is you have Donald Trump and others saying we want $6 billion to build a border wall, but instead $75 billion is going over to Ukraine. Some say upwards of $115 billion have already gone to Ukraine from the United States. And they say, look, you're sending $115 billion over to Ukraine. Why can you not spend $6 billion to do a wall? Well, we know the answer to that. It's politically charged and lots of other things are going on. But look at Joe Biden's budget. I mean, Joe Biden's budget actually slashed or wanted to slash DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, by $600 million. So you have folks within the grassroots, within the base saying, look, we've got to get our situation here in America straight before we can get, in essence, go over there and deal with what's happening in Ukraine. But either way, is a tightrope walk here. And I will just say this, that, Nikki Haley and others say it is America first. If you're going to stop Putin in Ukraine, just like Ronald Reagan said decades ago, if you stop them there, they won't fight you here. And that is America first. So both sides are having, in essence, kind of a battle over the words and the narrative.
Well, David, I'm not getting your anger on this one. You seem to be really excited about this issue.
Yeah.
Just in the history of the United States, you can go all the way back to George Washington. George Washington warned us all about foreign entanglements. But the isolationist movement that was present in the United States in the 1930s, we went through a Great Depression. We had to rebuild America. Let's focus on America. That absolutely led to World War II. Germany and Japan both thought that we would sit on the sidelines. And I just hate repeating the mistakes of the past. If we pull back now, you can pretty much guarantee Taiwan is going to be invaded. And that's not a future I want to see.
Well, just remember, of course, Gordon, as you know, just in recent history, I mean, we saw this starting to creep up, as we pointed out in the polls, but let's remember the Tea Party movement of 2010. That's where we started to see some of that. Rand Paul became a senator. His father, Ron Paul, had talked for a long time about what are we doing in these, what he called silly wars overseas. This has been permeating for a while in the Republican Party, and it was not until Donald Trump came along and then it just took off like a rocket ship, and that's where we are today, Gordon.
All right. Well, David, thanks for the insight, and thanks for your passion for it. Well, we've got some other news today, and it's a very sad announcement. Terry Mewson and her family are mourning the loss of her husband, Andy Friedrichs, who passed away over the weekend. A father, a grandfather, athlete, and coach, Andy was well loved and respected by all who knew him.
Andrew P. Friedrich, or Andy, as he was affectionately known, was married to the love of his life, Terry, for 42 years. A great athlete, he played basketball for Al McGuire at Marquette University, worked for the Milwaukee Brewers baseball club, and along the way served in the U.S. Air Force. The father of 7 children, Andy loved coaching their sports teams and was also a loving grandfather to 6 grandkids, with 1 on the way. Most people know of Terry's involvement with Orphans Promise, yet it was Andy's yes to adopting their daughters from Ukraine that contributed to the founding of the ministry. It's been said Andy never met a stranger. Andy Friedrich was 76 years old.
Well, Terry's going to be off the show for the next couple of weeks, and our thoughts, our prayers are with her and with the entire family. This is a time of great loss for them. But without Andy, there wouldn't have been an Orphan's Promise. Terry's heart was always to go overseas and adopt everyone she ever met. I used to tell her, look, on this trip, please don't bring anybody home. But Andy said yes, and he said yes to 3 sisters, and they took on that challenge, and with that, a great ministry has been birthed in the world, now serving in over 60 countries, helping orphans all around the world, and it's all because Andy said yes. If you want to honor his memory, honor Terry's service, honor Orphans Promise, is pure and undefiled religion when you take care of widows and orphans. So if you'd like to give to Orphans Promise, it's real simple. As a memory gift, as a tribute gift to Andy and his life, Orphans Promise, CBN Center, Virginia Beach, Virginia, 23463. Just put Orphans Promise in the memo line of a check. You can call us, 1-800-700-7000. Just say, I want to give a gift to Orphans Promise in memory of Andy. Or you can go to cbn.com. There's a place on the website where you can designate your gift to Orphans Promise. Do it now. 1-800-700-7000.